Nice. So, people who haven't participated in the conference, in the panel before, these people I would ask to go first. Like, what's your approach to this subject? Right? What do skills contribute in the perception of electronic artifacts? What is the reliance on skills? What is the meaning of our skills when we deal with electronic artifacts as users? So who would like to be the first? Yeah, so I would ask to tell a little bit about what you do, about who you are, okay, about what you are, and speak a little bit about your approach. On your approach. Okay, so maybe we should start with Mark, since Mark is the first one to come. So if you don't mind, Mark, could you please?
Okay, I may be the.
Yours.
Am I muted? No, for once. I may be the least suitable person to go, but I write and publish hypertexts, broadly considered, and hypertext tools. More tools than hypertext, but that's the way things break down. And though trained as a chemist, I've spent most of my career doing software development and/or computer science. And increasingly, I think that we valorize the digital in a way that's naive and essentially false. The digital is not that different from what we've always had, and it often makes manifest problems that we've always faced. I mean, Afternoon comes out and says that closure is a suspect quality because Joyce couldn't figure out how to end Afternoon. And that, he wanted to say, is okay. And in fact, it is a irrelevant formal requirement that we get back to the tonic and end in a grand cadence. And we don't have to. It's not decreed. The sky is empty. And even for something that seems to be a easily circumscribed experience, like a painting, I'm not sure a painting is ever closed, or that we ever can say we understand it, or that our understanding it won't change tomorrow or 20 years from now. The other thing I wanted to mention was Stacy Mason at Santa Cruz just finished a dissertation that's quite interesting on agency and responsiveness. Agency being our sense of control when performing something like a computer game, and responsiveness being the computer's sense of controlling us, really, of responding to what we do and taking that into account. They're not precisely the same thing, even given that the computer isn't a person. But it's an interesting combination, and one that's perhaps worth looking at. And I have no idea if this is of any use or relevance.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Okay.
And my audio cuts out for 4 seconds from time to time. Sorry.
Can I just mention, Mark, Stacy Mason was my student at the University of Florida when she was an undergraduate. Yeah. Terrific student.
Yeah, she just finished literally yesterday.
Wow, good for her. Yeah, that's sweet. Good. Sounds really, really interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, in fact, yeah. So, Mark, you started with the idea that the agenda that the electronic art, let's say, in general, poses is not quite new. Like it's not entirely new, and this is interesting because when I was having a panel with the Russian guys, there was a guy named Pavel Arsenev who actually deals with the material culture of literature, with the early Soviet avant-garde, for instance, which actually poses a very explicitly poses the agenda of what materiality of paper is, of what materiality of literature is. And now we're speaking about a different kind of materiality, which is digital, but in a way, definitely, we're dealing with similar issues. There is a material resistance, which is kind of unexpected, yeah, because this is kind of software, right? Something that we wouldn't expect to resist our resistance, right? But it does eventually. Okay, thank you, Mark. So, Mr. Manetas, would you take the floor, please?
Yes, hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me on this. Okay, I should speak a little bit about myself. I am an artist. I start my career dreaming to be one day a painter, but as I was untalented, I end up becoming one of the people who are known as relational aesthetic artists. Artists that are working with aesthetics. Yeah, okay. It's like a whole group of people that Nicolas Bourriaud, a French curator, put us together, my generation, and they called us relational aesthetics. Practically working with all kind of stuff apart of painting, with things that they create relations, and they put into questions relations. Then exactly from the launching exhibition of this art tendency, which was in 1995, I decided actually to collect my courage and make my first painting, kind of like trying to not behave well with, misbehave, to not like go with the flow. And to make this painting, I had to call somebody on the phone, and he explained me how you do it. I was very surprised, but actually the instructions to come to know how to make a painting, but even like high level, that can be Raffaello or Tiziano, are not so many. It's just a few instructions. Of course, the most important of it is that you have already interiorized all the hypnotism of painting from museums, speaking about painting, the Western kind of painting, okay? The Western kind of representation. Anyway, this thing happened in my life, like the moment I was about to follow a certain route, I went to another. I became a painter from one day to the other. And as I was invited to make important exhibitions in important museums as a painter now, and I started looking around kind of urgently for a subject, because I thought the most important thing if you are a painter is to have a subject which is unique and has not been represented before. And that subject was there on my desk. I had bought it like a year earlier, and it was a laptop, a power book. So now this thing that was on the table, I really had absolutely no idea about computers before, although I had read the book of William Gibson, Neuromancer, and it had like influenced me in a strange way that I couldn't really understand how, but I had relate with this book. Later, I realized that actually it was the memories of ketamine and psychedelic experience through ketamine. William Gibson was a junkie of ketamine. As a later friend of both of us, me and Gibson, John Perry Barlow told me, they were both junkies of ketamine. And so I relate to that from there. Also, this has maybe something to do with the physicity, right? There is something like, okay, sorry, I'm putting like many things together, but that's like the way my brain is wired. So the moment like I look at this computer and then I wouldn't remember if anyone else had ever painted a computer. No, nobody had done it. So I start representing the computer. Now, initially I was interested for the computer as a hardware creature, like this new thing that talks back to you, but talks in a manner that is different than a tape recorder or a radio. And it has light, but its light is different than the light of of this thing. It's like a creature of light, and inside it has things are moving also inside, and then you have to touch it. So these like three things. And me, I was a barbarian. I mean, I had absolutely no idea how to use it. I just like click and try to. So the touching thing, the digital thing, was what related me with this computer. And I start painting it, like making big portraits of it. Large portraits of computer. Happily, the laptops were gray that time. They still are monochrome. So you can actually paint them easily. You just make a monochrome, a gray monochrome, when they are closed. And then when they are open, again, it's not so difficult to paint them. Anyway, I would paint from projections. So I would take a photograph, project it, and then paint it, or use an assistant if it was a little more complicated, to paint it first, and then I go on the top and paint on the top of it. So that was the way I got married with the digital. I started like getting, and then I got married, but in the family then came this other thing that is the internet, and then the whole planet fall into that together with. While I was making a family with the computer and with the internet, everybody was also making a family, and we all became a big, nice family. And I end up being kind of a digital artist myself, although I never became a digital artist. It was just a casual encounter that would bring me to actually make kids, if we can call that, produce with the digital modus operandi. Down the road, I also create an art movement for which I bought a name from a company, the same company that have given to my beloved laptop its name, PowerBook. This company was Lexicon in California, the company that made Pentium, and later it made also the name BlackBerry. And it was a company that would make names. It's called Lexicon. And I commissioned to them the name of my art movement, which was now searching in the dark to see if we can create new stuff, right? Things that they have not been seen yet. And they can give us new emotions, which for me, they were also a treasure because I could paint them, because my intention was to paint. So this was like something like 10 years of experience. I became a painter, I became a digital artist. Then at some point I started feeling anxious that, oh, what about this, the eyes and the hands? And at some point, after some kind of personal crisis, lost in the forest of the Amazon in Colombia, after getting lost there, after getting lost in different forests and in Israel and Palestine. At some point, after also a big accident, I grab a pencil, I grab a brush, and I start painting on the top of reality. So actually, like doing this, just like looking and drawing on you. Okay, so I started doing this and I thought, okay, now I can go on the rest of my life by doing this. I don't need. But because on my left hand was attached already a cell phone, and that was a BlackBerry back then, I started filming it also. I mean, it came normally. I just didn't want anymore to be inside that place. But at the same time, I wouldn't refuse it. I couldn't. It was there, attached. It was smaller than this thing. So, but the BlackBerry was like a little thing. It can make only a black and white film. You couldn't do many stuff, right? So there I reached, I don't know how they call this, the Indians, when you have illumination, Satori or something. I reached, or the Japanese, I don't know. I reached like full happiness and illumination. I was a happy man. I could go on the rest of my life by drawing on the top of the real and filming it. This nice little black and white film that felt like the memory of what I was looking at. But I was conscious that the real painting is this invisible painting that is happening there. So for me, this was like the top of digital. My top digital experience was exactly this, digital, really digital, because it has to do with fingers. Then things, the paradise didn't last a lot. Samsung came and gave me one of the first of these, yes, frigorifero in Italiano, yes, large stuff. And then it took me like a year, but then I started using it, and then my whole life changed again. I fall again into digital. And that's where I am now. Again into the nightmare of the many things. So I don't know if this description of myself can help somehow your research.
Well, of course, it's very relevant because you're speaking of the like you relate the digital to the fingers. So and this is, I believe, really essential because we are speaking about the entire nervous system involved, right? So in fact, to me, well, this is the ultimate idea, maybe, how we could involve the entire nervous system in the perception of an artifact. Well, even when we're speaking about the production of an artifact, well, this is the other side of perception. There is also quite a problem about whether we can say that, well, the perception is something that reproduces the production, right? This is quite a problematic question, but in fact, I do believe that the perception that deals with skills is kind of associated with the skills applied in the production. So this is what you're talking about. And well, this is really, really relevant, I believe. Now, thinking is at hand as well as in the head, right? And this is kind of great importance, I believe. All right, so we will get back to it. Yeah, so now I suggest we might get to Erik Zepka. Might switch to you, man. So
cool.
Please.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, we're good. Okay. I love that you bring together, I love the groups that you're bringing together, Kirill, and thanks so much for inviting me along. And I think there's a real value to bring in people from pretty different, from people who might not be in the same conversation, you know. And I think there's a real potential to kind of spark new kinds of conversations. So yeah, I'm really honored to be here, and I'm gonna take you guys through a bunch of works. Oh, you've disabled screen sharing. Can you enable screen sharing?
Well, yeah, it wasn't me. I just didn't enable it. So I didn't disable it, just didn't enable it. So here we go.
Okay, so I can't. Oh, here. Okay, so you did it. You did it. Okay. Okay, so let me just. Let's see. Okay, so what I'm going to do, my focus really is on a question of new media and a question of what it means to be sort of accelerating into all kinds, like what computation and what electronic media sort of imply. And for me, it's this sort of, it's an environmental question, it's a media question, it's a question of how we're changing the inscriptions that are around us and how computation is sort of at the core, and it's sort of configuring what it is that object that we've, you know, that both Mark and Miltos have already talked about in a really interesting way, that sort of that consideration of what that is both not innovating necessarily, but whatever that book was, or whatever that painting was, or whatever the sort of media that we have, it's sort of reconfigured in a certain way. And for me, it comes down really to an environmental question, and a question of how we both objectify and inscribe on different types of objects, and then rematerialize or re-inhabit those spaces. How do we both write, and then how do we in turn read or you know, relay, do a reading or speak it, or you know, where do we put it? You know, we have sort of the bookshelf, and then we have what are the spaces now in which all these things are inhabited. So fitting to the theme that we're talking about here, the first place I sort of went, a lot like Mark, I guess, is to the computer, is to code. Well, I guess like everyone here, I mean, it was really for me the realization that if I'm trying to be writing books and I'm trying to be sort of dealing with this this medium and trying to contribute in some way, or think about it, or do something with poetry or with nonfiction, fiction. So my background is sort of laboratory. A lot of different medical sciences, environmental health and genetics and pathology and immunology, things like this. So I'm sort of bouncing around between different labs, doing a lot of medical research. My degree ends up being in philosophy and science, and meanwhile, I'm building up what I guess becomes a media practice, and it really starts with that writing question. So it's really a privilege for me to think about it this way, and I just think, okay, well, you know, I really should be thinking about the screen and not the page, right? What does that look like? So I'm going to take you through how that evolves, and then how I rematerialize that, and that's sort of the trajectory that I'll go through. Is the sound good? For some reason, everybody disappears for me when I put the screen share. So is the sound still okay?
It's good.
Yeah, everything, okay. So, and you can see the screen here where my cursor is, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so now we go back. Okay, so this is going back. This is kind of through the 2010s, and I'm gonna go kind of chronological. So some of you might know the remix, Randy Adams. He's a guy who just across the pond from me. I'm from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. And some of these works are coming in dialogue with this group. Of course, Flash at that time so a lot of this work is ActionScript and playing with ActionScript. This is, as you can see, it's sort of like a word base, and then it's generating it. And then the location, the X and Y is sort of randomized, and the size is randomized. And some of the color is actually a picture background that it's masking. Let's see, so then we got this I'm calling semiotics lessons. This is basically a click-through image and sort of definition. It's kind of dictionary of visual aesthetic. So it's kind of an image. This one you just click through, and the myth to meaning is the reference in the I'm forgetting his name. Oh, Franco. is what the German title is referring to. So his sort of meaning-based, his what I would call a Kierkegaardian kind of psychotherapeutic or a psychological kind of method. But yeah, so I'm really attracted, I guess, roughly speaking. So this is kind of generating, there's a randomized size. It's distorting based on two randomized factors, and then it's putting them in different locations, kind of building on what the words were doing. And some of the themes that I'm attracted to, I think, are kind of creating environments. And there's some visual poetry here. There is some environmental kind of, or let's say, spatial considerations. I'm thinking about the way that concrete linguistic experiments really look at what is the actual alphabet, or what is the actual isotype or symbol that you're using, and then thinking about that. So I'm really attracted to that. Yeah, I'm really attracted to almost kind of turning that into a bit of an effective experience. So that Frankel inspired piece becomes visual, and also kind of thinking more about affect, I think, than maybe something like the Roman alphabet might, right? Thinking about how maybe more towards pictographs, but then even further into something that, it's like, well, what can we do with motion and with the sort of the way that you can manipulate space? And you'll see that gets more and more into things like 3 dimensions and stuff as I go along. And then also obliqueness. I like the sort of, I don't know, this sort of weird emptiness of the and formalness of the digital sphere. Let's see if this is, yeah, right. So this you kind of try the oblique interface, trying to sort of work with things. And so you have these sort of objects, but they're sort of dense in a way. And if there is, the semiotics is sort of almost absurd. You get to a point where what the reference is, or what that alphabet is. You have syllabaries, alphabets, you have pictographs, and so you have even in like the Egyptian writing, even though they're pictographic or hieroglyphic, they're sort of evolved pictographs. They often behave like syllabaries, so their use becomes this utilitarian element. So for me, it's very interesting that we have these kind of isometric images, right? So a multi-perspectival image. This is really what most depiction is through history. And perspective is a bit of an anomaly, but multi-perspectival, or sort of these two-dimensional sort of pictures, are in a way doing much more, because so many infographics and blueprints and so on to this day use this method because of how it's almost like having infinite perspectives at once. Like if you imagine how a camera is, it's sort of an imitation of our kind of like, head case, so you have this sort of like one location. So binocularity is almost inconsequential immediately once you get past an arm's length, and then you have a whole environment, but it's all emanating from this one spot, right? We've lost the 360 vision of the prey. We've got this sort of predator kind of one location thing going on. And what you do in 2D is you kind of expand that into this bizarre, impossible kind of box. So it's like we've averaged out all the different, positions that you can have, and then created this 2D, very informatic image, right? One that's sort of informationally dense. So I'm really attracted to this. I'm really attracted to playing with that and turning that flatness, if you will, into a kind of experience. So you don't quite get to the words in a way, or you don't quite get to a semantics. And then some pieces like this one, position that just a bit off. There we go. And then I'll just add a new effect that just makes it just a little bit more. So this really is an evolution of that piece, but I decided to make, I don't know, it's almost like that particular type of motion and blur just gives it, that particular type of blur gives it a sort of illusion of motion. Okay, so this is the beginning of where I start to play a bit with the space where isometry and perspective kind of collapse. So I'm really attracted to things like billboards and other flat images, but within something that starts to give dimension. So this actually does shrink a little bit, but it's so dense that you don't really, the experience of the words, I guess, is sort of this sort of material thing, or this kind of encounter with an object. And here we go. So this again, we've got a sense of space and depth. go. So flatness and depth, and these actually do obey perspectival laws. So the math in this is just computing for them to recede and so on. But it's so, again, the flatness kind of makes it hard to really see what the path is, right? What you're actually kind of physically graphing out. And in this case, it's just a sort of hemisphere, semicircle. Back to 2D, multi-layers though. We've got many different layers. These again are just animations, but if you spend a bit of time, you see it's actually randomized, and there's actually little agents in each piece of text that picks up a different piece of text and then goes to a different randomized X and Y. And same with these little things back and forth. But I think if you did a video, it would be a very similar effect, but it's just slightly different, I think, when you code it. So yeah, getting more into, I'm doing things like video, I'm thinking about materials while I'm working in the lab, I'm thinking, how does that work potentially with this? And I'm getting more and more into this 2.5D kind of thing, right? So this again is, let's see this again is a blend. So these are just flat images with transparencies, but they're positioned towards the camera, and the camera is doing a perspectival thing. So you get this weirdness, and I like the saturation because then the density kind of makes it hard to get that actual perspective. Yeah. So, and they also turn towards the camera. This is one of the characteristics of a billboard. So so that flatness. So it's like when you play Doom, you know, or any of these early 3D games, a lot of them had, the enemy always looks the same, you know, and it's because it's a flat image, but it's actually kind of glued to the camera in a way. It's going like this. Sorry, is my camera visible to you guys? If I do gestures, does that even make sense, or are you just seeing the screen?
Yeah, we see you.
You see, okay. Okay, so yeah, again, interfaces that are sort of breaking down. I really like the UI kind of tool set. Yeah, so this is a bit of an idea of that. There's more. I won't go on. I think it kind of communicates a point. It's a lot of these themes. What I get more into is really kind of 3D, but I'll do a kind of quicker version of that to take you through that. I'll just take you through a quick PDF. So I think you get the idea. There's a sort of logic interface. There's a sense of saturation. There's a sense of an effective kind of semiotics that have turned from indication to emotion, if I could say that. So I'm going to just launch up here. Let's see. Okay, so that's going a bit ahead. So that's kind of early 2010s, more or less. Some late, starting maybe 2008 or 9. Anyway, so this now, okay, so this is 2010. This is some of my early, deeper 3D stuff, but now 14 to 16. So I'll just kind of rifle through, and you see the 3D gets more, but I'm also getting more into like scientific infographics and like advertising language. So I'm getting, I guess my tool set is just getting more. And yeah, stuff like this is a good example of where I am by like mid-decade. Yeah, stuff like that. And then I started thinking about, so the first thing I talked about was this environmental, this question of how it gets, let's say, published. Yeah, if you have that alphabetic script, whether you're using it in terms of indication with something like a manual, a technical manual, or scientific text, or in terms of evocation, or whatever you might call it for something like a literary text, how do you then publish it? How do you read from it? And so this is something I thought about for a while, and then I eventually came to a sort of vernacular of installation, of projection as sort of the immediate thing. Things like this. This is at a fashion show down the runway. This is really just a video, and then an interactive thing. So I start setting up different apparatuses. In this first one, I start setting up sort of objects that sometimes are connected to the projection, sometimes not. So it really is installation, I think, and thinking about how how the interface, which is right there in front of this, starts to interact, and how the interface itself, how that joystick or keyboard input device is itself another kind of part of the text, in the same way that the book cover and the pages and that sort of that material element. What is that? What is the book exactly? Yeah, and then there's a projection again that had an interface just on the other side. And then you start materializing it. So I start doing prints, I start doing objects, I start doing these then in installations. Here's multiple publications. Actually, I'm not sure if Miltos, you were a part, I think you might have been a part of this. This was at Arbeit Gallery Books. I think you had one of these. There's a whole bunch of media artists that were a part of this. You can tell me after, I guess. And then they all sent this to Arbeit, and then we did the exhibition based on that. It's a sort of vanity publisher that publishes them, and we got all these media artists to publish them as this combo of like commercial document or autobiography or whatever, But anyways, the material element is that here you have now a series of books. You have this sort of like the way that you can POD now, right? And you can sort of have this mass amount at once, and then none and lots. And so you've got the Toyota model sort of a production, right? Where you can kind of get a ton and then nothing and so on. Postcards, extremely ephemeral kind of things like that. That's another print. And then it comes together sort of with my laboratory background and sort of creating these are myocytes. So it's just meat cells and hematocytes or blood cells, and different bacteria that have been spliced in, GMO'd in with this jellyfish protein. And then you've got basically a UV bed, a kind of sterilizer. And then getting back to that interface, now I'm creating these sort of objects. Sometimes these are gardens, sometimes they're mounds of sort of different biological material. And these were input devices. So this is a kind of a joystick or a game controller. And this is taking waste and turning into different robots. And this is working with a lot of molecular stuff too. So this is an E. coli thing. And building a kind of science fiction narrative around that. So in that first image, which I'll end with, you can see that there are, on these tables, a lot of the objects we've now seen close up are placed there. And they have museum style kind of infographics on them. So where I end up with, I think, is that, we have a new media kind of movement. Computation kind of accelerates different media possibilities. We have at the base a kind of video game, a kind of interactive screen, something like the hypertext that Mark is producing. But then we have the material question that I think Miltos is groping with, which is, okay, well then what is that? What is that touch that you were talking about, Kirill? That, like, what is that regrasping? How do we then read and sort of put these texts back in our environments? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Erik. So I would say that when we're speaking about the capability of an interface, not just to facilitate, the interaction, as if there was no interface at all, when we start taking it into account as something essential, I think we start kind of speaking about certain terminology of interaction. I mean, because this is something that actually constitutes our experience. I mean, the way how we are disengaged our perception is from the object of our perception is the part of how we are engaged in the end of the day, right? So, and when you're speaking of all those weird interfaces, well, they do not just serve to facilitate the interaction, right? They also serve to kind of make it more complex. So this is what I call probably the phenomenology of interaction. Okay, so, and if I asked you, for instance, what do these things have in common? I mean, what Mark does, the textual, the IF, area, let's say the textual stuff, what Miltos does with the paintings and what you do with the visual video games, right? What do these things have in common? There's very different practices. But I would say that they do have in common this approach, this attitude towards how the artifacts are to be approached. There is no easy way, right? There are things that complicate it, complicate the road of perception, but this is of utmost importance because this complication involves our neural system as it is, especially when we speak about the interfaces that demand a lot of physical, well, some physical effort. Okay, this is what I'm speaking about when I'm speaking about touch. For me, touch is, well, is physical effort. All right, touch is something that provokes resistance, material resistance. And I would refer to another participant of the panel, Jesper Joule, and his book Casual Revolution, where he actually speaks on those interfaces that are capable of an alienation, pretty much. When we gotta, for instance, relate with their character in a video game, for instance, in a complex way, we're kind of alienated. That this is kind of something that engages us at the end of the day. So this is hypermediation that actually takes place there. And I had it, yeah, since no one seems to be willing to speak up for now, as far as I understand. And
I have a question.
okay.
Are you looking for questions, Carol?
Yes,
So,
yes.
just a question for Erik. I also have one for Miltos, but for Erik, I wondered if you, that was a terrific, super interesting. And I wondered if you thought explicitly about your project relative to pop developments of transmedia, franchise branding, that kind of cross-platform, multi-device kind of spread or expanded field of new media, perhaps to say it that way. I wondered if you thought, because it seemed to me that I see poetics of that in your work, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thanks so much first, Gregory. And I mean, I'm a big fan. And by the way, let me just interject this. My old account got hacked and we were in contact a lot. So that new request I gave you is because I don't have access to any other account now. So that one I requested you from, please, please add me there because I need your wonderful.
You've been acting like this was like you're trying to sell me some, insurance or something.
Okay, it's good to hear because it was traumatic. It was like the worst hack I've had. And yeah, you're not alone, but I'm reaching out and I'm saying, hey, no, it's me. This is my account. So, okay. So yeah, I need your wonderful poetics on my feed again. And feedback like this is awesome. So I really appreciate that coming from you because I am a big fan. And yeah, so I love that question because I think that it's kind of the nemesis, right? Like, but it's all laid out there, materially speaking, you're bang on. And it's so hard to theorize, I have found, because I mean, the quick answer is yes, absolutely. And I've been trying to sort of reckon with it, right? And it's very difficult because it's this quagmire of sort of commercial crap, and yet, I mean, oh my God, there's almost nowhere else I can go, And I mean, I've done things like I spent a lot of time in Asia the last few years. And as I'm traveling, I'm spending a lot of time in malls and casinos and video game centers. And I mean, I'm like, if I'm going to materialize what I do, this is it. And exactly the way that you said, so it's precisely that, yeah, it's that, but I'm going to try and create some kind of aesthetic counterpart or counter reply to that. And yet, materially speaking, yeah, I mean, they have the means, they have the, and they're responding to what the same environment is, maybe opportunistically, I might like to say, or, something like that corporately. But certainly the material circumstances are the same and the means are much, much greater. So it's like this is kind of the realization I had too with video games. I realized pretty quickly, I was like, all of the grammar of what I'm doing is already there. And I was playing kind of art games. So I'm like, no, I'm just going to get right into the commercial ones, even though maybe I don't like the content and some of it's kind of repetitive, technically speaking. Again, you can go from video art to film and you can do this over and over again. And I think that there's a huge lesson there if you can find a way to conceptualize it. So that's been the huge struggle. And I don't know how far I've gotten, but certainly I've spent a lot of time with it. And I think that there's a sort of overabundance of technical material and a kind of dearth, this kind of this kind of pit that you get sucked into. But I've gotten very close in how I deal with like my presence on Facebook is in some way trying to respond to that. I'm trying to respond all the time to this weird mimetic thing, the way it's getting constantly encroached and slowly kind of taken over by this corporate garbage, this identitarian, like everything's the same and everything's crap. And now they've got like, the corporate presence is now just fully embedded. And you've got a stupid video channel you can't get rid of unless you get like a script on there. And it's just crazy, I did an exhibition at the Tate where I did a kind of performance where what I was selling was a kind of corporatized version of me. So my XOX Labs or XOXOX.com is kind of like a bad brand because it's not one you can Google. It's not one with an identitarian kind of uniqueness, right? This is very important for SEO. So it's kind of like a SEO failure. It's an SEO fail. And if you Google it, you're going to get all kinds of stuff, right? But then all the corporate models I've sort of taken with that. So what I started to do was take in different logos and take in different corporate branding elements. And what I did is I just sold like T-shirts. You saw the mug in my thing and mouse pads and just all that kind of paraphernalia crap. And I sold that, and it was a kind of performance. So I had this sort of script where I would say, I'm gonna discover who you really are and what kind of person you are inside. And they'd always end up being like a Twitter person or a Facebook person or something like this, right? And the rhetoric was almost identical throughout. But what really was going on was the cultural side of what you're talking about. And I think the closest I've gotten to really doing justice to it. But that kind of idea of technical richness, this is, I think, what capitalism brings us is this incredible proliferation of new gadgets, new trash, and just a kind of a complete sameness constantly, like that Hollywood plot over and over again, and that kind of commercial pitch over and over again.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, Joseph Beuys, was amongst others in the Fluxus group was interested in multiples. And so like you would have multiples, you would make 1,000 little fish, that he maybe like he would consume some like a sardine, and then he'd keep the bone and then, make a multiple out of it and have 1,000 of those.
I mean, not only did he predict it, but he's got this wonderful soft biomaterial thing all the time, And yeah, I think that's a really nice reference because I love that his reproduction was this kind of, it was this manual thing and physical thing. Yeah, I mean, the more I go back to him and you have this sort of bioart history, I'm like, I don't know, man, like decades before this, and I would want to go back further and so on because any one of these labels, right? It's just kind of like,
But I'll say one more thing. I think you should embrace the transmedia sort of homology or whatever. I mean, because what I'm finding, theoretically is that, and this would be agreeing with what Mark said at the beginning, is all of these things already have been invented. I mean, these things are already available, and there's that high pop connection, where it turns out they're sort of mutually supportive of one another. And my analogy would be like writing. We couldn't leave writing in the hands of the pharaohs, right? We can't leave transmedia in the hands of the corporations. Like, yeah, they're putting billions of dollars into it, and they're inventing this thing. We need to take it away from them, or use it on our own behalf, and see what we can do with it. From this more, liberated, emancipated point of view. I think I would embrace that rather than resist it, I would say.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me just say that's it's not, I'm not seeing it around me a lot. And a lot of times people are like, I don't know if, like there's a little bit banal here, or, so it's really nice to hear that. And I mean, I just right now I'm just thinking how this sameness within, the terms and how they calcify and how they sort of get reproduced on that corporate level, that capitalist pharaoh level. I think your proliferation of terms is exactly the kind of response that I think is really interesting. So I really appreciate that coming from you because yeah, it's I found it really difficult. You have to kind of carve it out, and you have to really contextualize it for people, for them not to see it as, oh, okay, you know, this is really jaded, or this is really intense, or, you know, and yeah, to really see that, I mean, for me, it's like I felt like there's no other way kind of to go. So I think the way that you're framing it is really, it's nice, it's encouraging, because I think that, yeah, I think I agree. I don't know. I mean, it's everywhere, it's around us, and yeah, if the Pharaoh has the language, ugh, you know, that sucks.
Yeah.
Well, you know, speaking about the, well, you've actually noted, yeah. Let's, for instance, take the works or the medium, a medium that contains considerable element of randomization, where, as you said, Erik, you cannot get pretty much to the bottom line of it. You cannot get all the possible options. You cannot get all the possible semantics out of it, because it's always different. Well, yes, well, actually, this reminds me of a talk that I've been having with Alan Sondheim. We were discussing TikTok, and he told me, well, these images move so fast, and this is just mind-blowing. This is crazy. And I told him, well, let's, for instance, take Eisenstein, take Zika Vertov, early Soviet avant-garde. Weren't they doing similar stuff? And he told me, well, the difference was that they were dealing with particular artifacts that were limited by particular boundaries. And well, there is a difference between the unlimited set of frames and a limited set of frames. But to me, this difference is not that clear, because when you're actually watching a frame, well, a set of frames, right? And when you do this tacitly, like one after another, when you do not have the preliminary idea of the boundaries, well, this raises the question of whether we can actually approach this idea of the integrity of a piece. Because, for instance, with the texts that contain random elements, it seems to be impossible, because there are no boundaries at all. So what would constitute a form in these things, in these objects, like in the objects of yours, Erik, or let's say Ted Wernell's, for instance, pieces with a lot of random. So what actually is the difference between a medium like this and a particular art form, a particular artifact? So this is something I would ask you about. What's the difference between the medium that is always recurrent, that always reproduces itself, and the very particular, the unique, if you will, artifact?
Is a question for me?
To anyone. I believe this is a question to anyone.
Yeah, I'll just put in that I love the montage reference, because I think it really gets at what Gregory really insightfully brought up for me to think about. And that's this, I mean, really what's going on with a lot of that constructivist art and the kind of like semi-stat kind of style stuff is that they're doing exactly this thing. It's an early modern kind of version, or an early 20th century, you know, interwar version or Russian revolutionary version of what Gregory is really talking about, which is taking all this language, you know, in the montage, yeah, it's sort of responding to that speed and those crazy cuts and those really violent kind of like transitions in so many ways is doing exactly that. And also just add that it's really great that you bring in Ted Wernell, because he was also part of that remix group. And yeah, he was one of my best sort of friends. I've never met him. He's just in Lethbridge. He's very close, but he's just super reclusive, and he just kind of keeps doing his own thing, which is really great. But we were in like, you know, internet contact for a long time. And he, for me, was a really big, he supported me, you know, and he was one of the first kind of people in whatever kind of like community that I was like, I would say he's a little bit more formal or something like this, but it's certainly very visual, like you're saying, and it's certainly dealing bang on with that sort of that interface crossover that that Gregory brought up, and you've kind of folded into other times and periods.
So yeah. So what is the surface? What is the surface? Actually, you've been also speaking about, and I would say that Miltos has also touched upon that. So like there is a surface and there is a depth. So what is the surface and what is the depth of a digital artifact? What if I ask Mark, for instance, what would you say? What if I asked, for instance, what is the surface of a digital literature artifact and what is the depth of it? You know what I mean? Like there is something, there is a set of rules, for instance. Is it the surface? Okay. And what might be the depth of it? So what actually is the point where user and an artifact meet? Where do they meet? What is the surface to the domain?
Can I respond to that maybe?
Oh yeah, please
Maybe
go
it's
ahead.
completely like bullshit what I'm gonna say, but you just inspired me something. So my feeling from the depth of the digital artifact is that it's actually memory. Is our memory of the world, from my point of view, right? Because from my point of view, at this moment of my life, I try to actually look everything in relationship with my being, with my existence, with what I remember of the world. Who am I? I am a guy. I am not a woman. I'm a man. So all these things, I am a privileged man. So I try to take all this in consideration, and the memory, the fact that I remember things. I also not only remember them, but I actually have built a life on remembering them. So painting is exactly this. You remember Tintoretto, and when you paint, you try to put some of it in your art. And actually this also gives you food. So when it comes to digital, when we do computing, what we do actually there, I think, like from my point of view, is while we are touching, we try to also recognize ourselves on the simulation. So we are looking at the simulation, we are looking at the program. That's also why I have worked with video games. For example, I did a video game where Super Mario is just sleeping. For which I did nothing. I just left Super Mario to sleep, because if you don't play the game with him, he falls down under a tree or wherever he is, and he falls asleep. So I thought this is like the maximum, the highest level of video you can ever arrive, because you don't have to do anything. You just you don't play the game, and the game gives you back a perfect model to remind you who you are, what do you do in this world, how do you act. So the touching with the memory is what is the big attraction here. I also see this on my daughter and the other kids now of her age. She's 9 years old. So why does computer grab so much her attention? There is something there with the memory, with the active memory, though, the use of memory while we live something and we feel we are memorizing it, or when we have memorized. Okay, that's what I want to say.
Can I ask a question of Miltos that's related, hopefully? So Miltos, I loved your presentation, and I think it was itself a work of art. And I don't know if you think of that blend of living and telling in that way. But I wondered if during that period of your illumination, which is a period, however long it was, that I envy and admire. And I wondered if since you had in your left hand, sort of like now grown there, if you were recording, or if someone was recording you while you were painting the world in that way. And I'm thinking of the work of Yves Klein, because I had mentioned Fluxus to Erik, and now I have Fluxus in my thoughts. And you know how he like that famous picture of him jumping out of the window, but it's actually, I think he's claiming he's suspended or something. But in any case, somebody takes a picture of it, or he invents a certain color of blue. I think of that sort of like conceptual performance or something. And I think of what you were doing as conceptual performance. And I wondered if you were theorizing or conceiving of your work in that way, or otherwise, if that period of work was recorded as such.
Yes. All of them, they have been recorded. All of these, the camera was on, so I was recording.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So there are all like recorded, and yeah. And then I went to some other level. Now I can stop. This moment that we are talking, I'm also drawing all of you.
Excellent.
Because I can't stop. Like I am like a software myself now, and actually these days I have kind of invented for myself a new way of drawing, which is you don't look anymore what you draw with your full vision, but with your phone, you go there and you isolate a part. So when I draw like your nose, and I should immediately say that I am not a person with abilities of drawing. I have never succeeded on making anything that looks alike, but I don't care, I go on. So I start like drawing your eye, because I look just on your eye. Now I'm looking at you, but when I look on my drawing, I see the eye of you. And then I go to the second eye, and then to the other side of the, so I am driving inside your face, and comes out something like this.
Yeah. Perfect.
Also, for the first time in my life, has some similarity to your face.
Yes.
This for me, mind-boggling, and I can't stop doing this. Like all day, I'm doing this because what is happening there? I mean, I wasn't able. If I would look at you and draw you, I would not catch this similarity. But if I will isolate a part of to where I look. So I don't know how does that work with my brain, right? Definitely it has to do with memory, with visual memory, with this. Anyway, I am becoming like an automat. That's like what I realized from, it wasn't my intention, but then looking at me, I am like, what are you doing, man? I'm like, okay, I'm copying the computers. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Kirill, and thank you for inviting me again to another afternoon. I always leave them with a huge rash of ideas, and you introduced me to so much new work. I also wanted to say that the discussion that has come up between Gregory and Miltos and Erik, of course, with respect to Fluxus, it also reminds me too, your work, Miltos, of some ideas that were first introduced to me through the Fluxus movement. And specifically, when I think of Fluxus art, I think, of course, of the central conflict in media that Robert Fillieu had in the 70s. For him, of course, the personal computer hadn't really arrived yet. It was to come another decade, and many of his ideas, as they were expressed by you with your work too, would also come up in his work. And he still remains for me to be a kind of model figure in terms of, you know, building up a lexicon or a vocabulary lexicon, to use your term, in terms of what, you know, how to respond aesthetically to an environment, technology, an economy, a post-capitalist economy that was already filling in the gaps for us more quickly than we could observe, identify, and actually do something with. And his central, I guess, thesis, or his central movement is he said, as an artist, he could identify his work through three stages, and he worked through these three stages with video art. And for him, he found himself too. He also used the term that the video modality was basically controlling him. So his way of showing agency, as he put it, was to make sure that everything was one of three stages. You had a well-made object in video, you had a badly made object in video, and you had a not made object. And his aesthetic was always looking at the not made as the highest form of aesthetic experience that you could get to. So, but how, the question for him was, how do you get to that point where you're not making, where you can create a not made object? And that becomes his phenomenological question. It becomes really the issue, because it was the video modality that made quite specific that problem, because the video seemed to record everything. It was becoming too easy to make objects, and even badly made objects with video, because the decay was quite profound, could still be considered sellable. It was workable, so it wasn't enough to make badly made objects the way he said earlier Fluxus art could work with. Now you had to achieve this other level, this not made. Now I find the question becomes even more interesting in the sense of how do you adapt a kind of failure question to the digital moment, where the environment itself has become so incredibly reproducible. And I think that's one of the central conflicts I see in Erik's work. I see it definitely in Miltos, even as a relational, even in relational aesthetics. And I was very interested in that movement when I saw it emerge in the mid-90s, because they were really working with many similar questions. There was an artist in Vancouver where I was working and doing research that showed me, we had many conversations. His name was Jeffrey Farmer, and his work was introducing me to his concept in relational aesthetics. And I think probably one of my favorite works of his was when he was sort of hired as by the Bank of Montreal to decorate one of their rooms, or provide some kind of art piece for them, the way banks would often buy artworks from very well-known artists. And instead he really disappointed them, but actually in fact made a fantastic piece. He just went into, found an unused office, and he just covered it with Post-it notes and walked out. And I still think it's one of my favorite pieces. And it came directly from many of the arguments we had in the 90s. So that's really something I'd like to throw into it. The other thing I'll end here is that we've heard about the environment through Erik's work and also through Miltos's work. The other point of conflict that I find incredibly inspiring for me, and I just finished a book on it called The Community and the Algorithm, is the question of collaboration. What I do find in this moment is that it has become, we can facilitate an aesthetic position through synchronous collaboration, because just as we are today, we're creating a piece together. We're forming a community that hasn't actually named itself yet, and that's a good thing. That's a good aesthetic position. So what I find really, really interesting about this moment here and now, whether it's in my memory or not, that it is being tweaked and engaged with from multiple perspectives in a synchronous fashion, using a permutational interactive media format that is in fact enabling. How it's enabling, I think, is still a question, but it's producing a not made state that I find very intriguing and very, very inspiring. And I'll just throw that into the pot of discussions.
Well, yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, among other things, I would ask, I would actually note that when there is a risk for a particular artifact not to actually become an artifact, there is always this, like tension that, well, contributes a lot to the effect that this artifact creates, and this has a lot to do with the, has a lot in common with the communities, with the cooperation. Like, for instance, today, a friend of mine, there was a wedding party, for instance, and we were going to visit him and his wife, and one of us, one of his friends, one of our friends, he just was very, very late, so we couldn't depart, and there was the tension that something wasn't going to happen. We had this feeling, well, this is not going to happen, something is at risk. The occasion is at risk. So I would compare this to how we create artifacts, and this actually gets us back to this dichotomy. Like, for instance, we can say that we know what we are looking at, for instance, right? We know how to approach it and how to treat it, because it's an artifact, it's a framed picture, for instance, on one hand, but on the other hand, when we're dealing with something tacitly without clear knowledge of what it is, there is always this risk that it can be unfinished, that our perception can be unfinished. And when we are creating something like this, there's always a risk that it can be possibly unfinished. And this actually is one of the reasons why I initially asked about the surface and the depth, because surface is something that comes after. This is something that actually is the interface, basically surface. Okay, that's
Kirill,
yep.
Yeah, you feel free to finish, but you're sparking all kinds of stuff. It's leaking out of my head. But I love this, the surface and the depth thing. I love that you brought that up. And actually, when I think of, I've thought a lot like the stuff that Mark's done and pioneered, hypertext as like, it was always interesting to me at first, sort of thinking about, and I've talked to you about this, thinking about how you have this sort of ELIT history, which takes a very particular kind of subsection of what was sort of the interactive kind of aesthetic environment. And then it kind of carves that out into, different terrains and so on. And I think more and more, and I think this is really speaking to what Andrew already articulated much better than I could, that we have a kind of, we're reconfiguring these things, right? And in inventing these sort of spaces and movements, this kinds of things that Gregory was talking about, we're sort of carving out this space where, when you look within video game history in general, and I've thought a lot about how hypertext kind of fits into that, and I'm really interested in how, on the one hand, it's like the text adventure, but then it's a lot like the graphic adventures, because you're really using point and click, but you have the text medium, but you don't have the text input and entry, right? So I think for me, it's situated in a really interesting place to be responding to that. But let me just jump a bit over to something that Miltos brought up that I think is really connected to another slew of thoughts that I'm going to lose, I think, quickly. Andrew, as usual, has encapsulated really well, I think, what's going on. And when he's talking about Filiu in relation to how he's interpreting some of the things that I'm up to, I was thinking with Miltos about the theater of memory and this this kind of how memory, now you see the memory loci. I think it's something like this. Now you have psychologists really, this is really kind of taking a place in the literature where you have the kind of, I can remember a billion words from this novel or whatever, and then you get their explanation, and what they're always doing, it's some variation on this, where they're sort of, what they're doing is they're creating a room and they're kind of placing around this room, and they're putting all these weird kind of odd things in this space, right? So they're creating a kind of like absurd theater, or a kind of space that's kind of animated. It's like a playground, it's like a little sandbox that you kind of want to touch that toy, and you want to go here, you want to go here. So like traveling the street and they see this duck, this yellow duck, and it's holding that word, and this kind of thing, right? And I think for me, theater really gets to the core of this question of remaking that object, remaking what that new surface and that new depth might be, right? And it is that filiu kind of impossible non-object, right? It is that sort of conceptual, it's almost a God thing, I think, right? That sort of that pillar thing that you'll make no matter what, but you can't really talk about it. But everything that you're building, whatever thought, system, is going to be relying on this sort of ephemeral thing. Or it can be, a materialism that is, what exactly is that material, right? Like, what's the fundamental material that you're actually, and I mean, as time goes on, that's going to change. As physics sort of, progresses in different directions, that's going to change the instruments we have. So we end up in, I think, a kind of theatrical space, right? Where for me, that's been a really influential thing. And I had a period where I was doing some theater work. And that was one way that, while being a scientist, I was actually doing this other aesthetic thing. And really, theater was sort of at the root of that. What's going on is that you have a performance, you have a sort of engagement, you have a ritual, you have an enactment, you have a kind of conversation at large, a kind of community that along lines of what Andrew was talking about. And yet you've got things, you've got objects, you've got sets, you've got apparatuses, you've got the Deus Ex Machina thing, you've got, so you've got these different things that are sort of part of it. But what's really key is not any one of those items. It's not the paintings in the background or the sculptures that you're using for part of the set. No, it's that particular enactment there that's going on at that moment.
Could I just mention about relational aesthetics related to that kind of motion or movement you're talking about? Was I always thought part of the importance of that was related to Derrida's difference of what he's trying to locate with that notion, which is that all of our ontologies, I think, in modernism are relational. They're all relational. There's no substance, no substantial, no Aristotelian leftovers, and so they're all relational. And so the key is the interval. And of course, Derrida's point about why nothing is ever finished and so forth is because the interval keeps moving. And I think one of the models of this has been, I wonder, I don't remember if Michel Serres used a particular model, but it's the idea of the 15 tile game, so there's actually 16 squares, but one is empty. And then of course you try to get the numbers into relationship, but that empty square is the interval. And if you don't have it, you don't have a game. You got to have the interval. You got to, that's difference, that's spacing that keeps everything going. Otherwise it's paralysis. It's Joyce's Dublin or something. I just think that's the relational bit. And I think that's what the non-object is. I mean, I think the interest in the non-object is you start being more interested in the interval and the spacing and the movement that enables the mobility of that, rather than whatever the 15 tiles. So the 16th empty tile is the space, is the one that's interesting. The others are there. If you don't have them, you don't have a game either. I mean, it's, but you got to have that space.
Mark, you wanted to say something? Okay, thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I have a question which may be so undergraduate that it's of no interest, but I'm going to try anyway, because why not? I've been revisiting Clement Greenberg's essay from 1939 on avant-garde and kitsch, which is very useful for thinking about video games and game studies and its discontents. But, and this was the essay which justified our shared common interest and exclusive concern in art as medium. I mean, we've been talking here a lot about the nature of the medium, and almost all the art that we've looked at is deliberately avant-garde, deliberately art about art or about medium. And but Greenberg writes from an explicitly Marxist, orthodox Marxist point of view, where he assumes that all of this is made inevitable by the breakdown of capitalism and the failure of any symbol to hold meaning. And that may actually have been sensible for Greenberg's youth, but it's not actually the world we ended up with, is it? And so I wonder, is the underpinning of our assumption that the nature of sensible art, meaningful art, needs to be concerned with its medium or itself, sitting on shaky foundation? Why are we worried about the surface, not what's behind it?
Well, in fact, I would say that, well, thank you, Mark, for your question. I would say that I come from the background of early Soviet avant-garde, which is artist. Entirely. If we take Eisenstein that I mentioned today, or Zuckerbertov, for these people, there was an idea of an industrial progress that is just bound to be formal, because its form is not a surface. The formality, well, the material is not a surface. This is what constitutes the future. This is what constitutes the humanity. And I would say that for these people, surface is functional. This is not something that is on the surface. This is something that constitutes the ultimate shape of a thing. And also, there is no surface that is 100% solid and taken for granted once and for all, because there's constant movement and the enormous speed. So what's behind the surface is tomorrow, basically. So this is, I'm speaking about approximately the same time when avant-garde and kitsch was written. Well, slightly before, the 20s, for instance, let's say the Soviet art of the 20s. There is no surface apart from today, and there is no depth apart from tomorrow. So these things are essentially connected, and avant-garde used to be our beauty. It used to be our nation. We had to be formally inventive for the sake of tomorrow. So you see what I mean? Have I answered your question? From my point of view, these things are just bound together.
Can I just expand on Mark's question just for a second, since he brought up Greenberg and the avant-garde just very quickly, just before I lose it, as Erik said before previously. There's one thing here, if we bring up Greenberg and his, of course, amazing essay in 1939 in the sense of what it led to, and you're right, the Marxism, which he later disavowed too, at that point, is important because it responds to something we might not easily find, and that's why I bring up the question of community. And I do think, first of all, one, as I've said in previous meetings, for me, the aesthetic is important because it's a political distance as well as a cultural distance. It's not so much that, if we go by the traditional Kantian idea of the aesthetic distance, that we choose to be distant, but that the object chooses to be distant from us. And we're always put in a space of distance because we can't actually get to the object. And we recognize that desire in us, and we recognize its literal failure to be fulfilled. Now, whether we interpret that in a Derridian fashion, that it is the interval that is partially choosing the distance or helping to form the distance from the object, it still is a very political issue, because what Greenberg recognized, that he had hoped that the class that was most distant, the worker, the class that was most exploited away, would in fact be the space where we could in fact find a more authentic relationship to objects and the medium itself. Because if the worker, the painter, the artist as the worker, the artist as the underclass, the artist doing the labor, could in fact be recognized for their project, their work, and they weren't so exploited, then in fact, we would have a better society. And at least Marx, understood that the labor underclass, would form a revolution. They would come, the artists would be there with them. But that was, a problem in 1968, of course, when the artists turned to the workers in Paris and said, "Hey, we're with you." And the workers said, no, you're not. Go back to your universities, go back to your white boxes, go back to the galleries. And that becomes, a very interesting conflict that Erik has brought up before, right? Because he says, well, how do I show these pieces? I don't want to be in the white box. I know it's not fulfilling for me. And the same thing with Miltos and the relational aesthetics too, as I find many of the very early conversations we had in the mid-90s was always, that it's just like, well, the parallel gallery system in Canada didn't work. They turned around and they said, look, we're not making any money. we can't go on with these national council grants. It's not really as fulfilling. But I would talk to playwrights and poets from the 1970s, and they would often, in bars where they got very emotional, they said, Canada used to pay me $500 a month just to make art, and I could live on that in 1973. I was able to do that. Look what we could do. Look what we did. We were free. We were free. They would shout that at me. This was 1990, and they say, we're fucked. we're not going anywhere with this. So that's just something I want to add to the conversation in the time we have left. When we think about it, because I think it does sort of come up is like how, how do we collaborate? How do we form these communities when in fact it's easy enough, but in fact it's as a political movement, as an aesthetic movement, the questions are still here. We are still in an interesting political space that might be increasingly difficult to interpret and understand critically, but also economically and socially. And I think that's part of the conflict.
A question, can I pose a question, please? Inspired by you too. Andrew says, okay, that we are collaborating. This is sure we are collaborating. Look at us, right? we all have all our other kind of stuff to connect, and we are connecting even more now, spending time. So definitely we are collaborating as data is collaborating. Okay, so if we think of data as some kind of artificial intelligence, it may be vulgar to think of that, but I think of it that way. It is connecting and it is collaborating and it is finding its body. At the same time, now, what are we? We are guys, okay? Not casually, we don't have a woman between us. We're guys. And at this moment of my life, I start confronting the fact, I may be wrong, but when I look at me, I see a warrior. I see someone who is in war. He has been produced for a war. I mean, I never thought of myself as a warrior. I always thought of myself as like an artist, intellectual, I don't know, like some kind of a crook occasionally, but not a warrior. But actually looking at me now, and in a country where you can't really fake it, such as Colombia, I am a warrior, one thing. Second thing, I am a privileged person, and I will never drop my privilege, not even unless it is more privilege for me to actually drop some of it. Okay, so there I actually become kind of Marxist. I also start like reading about Marx, but like the privileged Marx, the guy who was willing to drop some of his privilege to actually like find new stuff, get more education. That's what he was looking at. From my point of view, that's what Marx was struggling for. So privileged warriors, humans, in a moment of a possible extermination of the many, because now it's not anymore like if we will subscribe to some real fear for climatic and stuff. Okay, there is the possibility at least, and this makes it, together with the nuclear, makes it like a big possibility of extermination of the many, which means like the many, like the 95% and 98%, right? Now, when this comes to art now, there is one thing that it always impressed me on Western art. Western art is the only art that succeeds to have what before you refer to as kits, but actually I would call it like robotic art. Because when you put the word art into Google, it will not come out your Picasso and your Da Vinci and your El Greco. It will come out the sunset, the horse, the thing that like someone made in Santorini or made in Alaska, and is exactly the same, that kind of bullshit thing, which most of the houses is decorated with, which most people actually recognize as art and they love. It's beyond kids because it doesn't even try to look alike as something beautiful. It is something on its own. You know what I mean? So that kind of thing, when we look like on cultures of communities, when we go to the Amazon communities, we will not find not one sample. You will not find, and I challenge you on that, one Indio who is painting in a way that actually doesn't provide the image any information at all. Because that's what happens with the sunset, with the horse. It doesn't provide you any information. It doesn't tell you anything about the creator, about the context it's made, about the aesthetics. There's no aesthetics apply. So how does it happen that actually these Western societies succeed to make like the largest part of its cultural production, at least visual, this insignificant, like not informational, robotic, art, while all the other cultures, they don't have even one little sample of that. There is nothing there. So actually, is it maybe that actually this society, which started from the Greeks, then with the Romans, then Jesus came and all of that, is it producing maybe some kind of like human robots? Are they expecting for their software? Actually, we are not even expecting, it is installed in us. I mean, all this, it may sound like a bit like cheap Philip K. Dick scenario, but right? But why not like think of it? And are we in a war? Are we actually in a war? Are we like fighters in a war? Is this encounter here kind of a conspiracy to prepare a war, to see how far, is it alliances? Is it like what men used to do always, like prepare for a war against against what? Against ourselves, because we are the privileged. So from the point I'm looking at, if tomorrow, like, and when I say tomorrow, I mean the next 10 years. So in an earth that is very warm, and then these 10 years, actually, we have worked a lot to become all of us very rich. And how do we achieve this? There is actually a way to achieve it, and it's called NFT. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but NFT is a way to capitalize on digital information of any sort. And so if like it will go on the way it has started, and it really had a great start, very soon, all of us, meaning all of the privileged people who are like somehow who are masters of information, we can be making like tons of money of that. And it will be a new money, so it will have a lot more value, because you're not going to compare it with dollars or with euros. It will be like my artifact towards your artifact. So if the words of Andrew is like significant for me, like I would buy them for $1 million. So if this 1%, the famous 1%, will open up to become like a 2, a 3, a 4%, and the dynamic one, not like a place where you have one Bill Gates and he's like a multimillionaire, but it's like many multimillionaires, including ourselves. And then what are we doing with all this extra money, right? We are building scenarios of escaping in the sky, or maybe more simple, more realistic, under the earth. And like in about 10 years, the question is, let's go now, right? Let's go. Everything is ready. Like the Louvre is under, all the best artifacts are under, protected. Bye-bye. We go and we lock the doors. So that's what you inspire me now with these elements you introduced, and becomes political.
Yeah. I actually, Andrew, before you, I don't know if you have to go right now or if I have time to insert something if you want to, yeah, okay. So there's a couple of things that I'm thinking based on all the things that have been said. One is, one question I think that is a collective question right now is who is the agent in relation to the object? So I think what Mark began to bring up with Greenberg's work is how in the Marxian sense, this economic object, this sort of question that Andrew elaborated on, where if we want to look at this, I mean, I thought, now Greg's gone, but in relation to his Derridian work and Derrida's kind of continually returning to the book question, and Plato also is really fixated on this, and this is big for Socrates, who doesn't write, and yet here it is, he's in a book, and we know him because of that book, and he's often anti-writing and so on. And yet, there's this play that you still get in that book. And I'm not Derridian by any means, but I know that destabilized text is certainly something that we can use. So even once we get that object that for Socrates has all these worries of, say, ruining memory, the memory that Miltos is bringing up, right? And a lot of very present things, and there's super interesting dialogues. And yet, whatever that fixation is, that death, right? It's very much not that, right? It's very much this destabilized sort of element that we ask, well, who is that agent? Well, a Marxist would point to the laborer, point to the laboratory, point to that workshop, that place of labor where it is being produced, right? We can also think of the cultural element, right? What about once it is in society? We have sort of a society of mega production, right? The globalized system that Miltos is talking about is one that is sort of in a way oversaturated. And how many of the interpreters do we have? How many of these cultural kind of thinkers do we have? So anyways, I don't have any answers for sure, but I thought that we have this sort of question of who is the agent? Who are the important agents? Who are the ones that we want to be paying attention to? I mean, us here, we're certainly not producers on many levels. The artist or the theorist is in many ways not that labor at all, right? We're the person who is sort of going and looking at the object and making another argument, perhaps one of excess or one of maybe different kinds of labor. I think you can still go to a Greenbergian argument, but anyways, those are the things I was thinking, where this real question of the depth that Mark kind of put on challenged us to sort of be addressing, I think has everything to do with who is that agent, right? Okay, whatever. Okay, there's surfaces here, there. What is that agent? And this is the second train of thought that I got on is really Miltos' wonderful collage of ideas. So some things that I think of Miltos is that this world, weird world as some scholars call it, and that kind of Western situation, the guns, German steel kind of thing. I think this crossover between war and the economic question, or the question of capitalist privilege or privilege in whatever form we want to label it today, which I absolutely agree we have in spades. And why do we have it, right? And we could make a genealogy that, okay, it's something to do with this economic system and how that grew up. And the more environmental argument is something like I forget the Guns, German Steel author, his name. So these more longue durée kind of perspectives, or David Christian, or the big history kind of perspective, or the environmental perspective, will look at these factors that that are both just kind of continuous in any human group at any time, but look at things like geography and look at things like scale and population and basic sort of questions of geology to biology to geopolitics and the rest of it. And look at just how do you maintain something on scale. And I think Bitcoin is a really good, I did a curation in like 2014 on this, and this is kind of the first surge, I would say. This is kind of the Bitcoin age, right? We've got the NFT surge now. I think we're gonna keep having it more and more because it's just the implications of technologizing the economy, right? And the thing that has hit the fan in the last decade is the security question. And you need to address that deeply, much more deeply than we have with credit cards, where you see how many breaches there's been. Like you just look at like the history of hacking, right? And these are, they're kind of gold mines, right? And they're just not prepared for the age. And what crypto has started to do is look at those databases and look at those code systems and start to really, really look at how security works in those domains and really start to address it. And this is inevitable, right? We've got we're talking about how we've sort of got these objects and we've got this computational world. The next question is living in it, right? And the economic pragmatics of that is that sort of that security layer. And for me, I think the word connection is really prescient because this is a geopolitical thing, right? This computer, which is so much an American historical entity, and other nations that are sort of in trade and joining in on this, and the American market that's built around that. And how do you build that up? Well, you have 200 years of a very, very just militant industrial entity, that is building up and taking that Westphalian model, very practicalist model, and sort of building it. And yeah, I almost started to think a little bit about the whole Martian trip, and like, okay, if we have a thing there and we actually want to be maintaining, I mean, it's going to be so freaking mediated. If we have anything already, if you want something where you're in, you're in the Arctic and you're in this continent and that continent, I mean, you need such a technological infrastructure for that to even be a possibility, right? And decentralization and getting those technologies more reliable is absolutely an integral part of that. And I mean, it's war, it's the West is making war on the world by sort of, bringing this globalized structure.
Oh yeah, to me it seems like if the symbol's meaning is the war, then maybe it's a good thing that meaning gets detached from a symbol. I mean, detachment is very Marxist, isn't it? Like the labor, the workers are detached, disengaged from the products of their work, right? And what about us? I mean, what about the artists? How much are the artists disengaged from what we do? I mean, isn't this disengagement that what we do belongs to the readers, for instance? Like, it's also some kind of war, isn't it? Like, the reader is an intruder. I mean, it's an always welcome intruder, but it is an intruder. They are the intruders, right? Because you do something just to give it away. And the normal literature, the literature that is traditional, is totally, it has no capabilities of resistance towards the readers. Right? There's not many ways to protect itself. The readers, well, I'm joking, of course. It's not that literature has to protect itself from the readers, but yes, well, it's not for the sake of the literature, it's for the sake of the readers. That literature has to become more resistful towards the reading, more challenging. And this is where the IF comes. I mean, I really admire interactive fiction because it challenges me, and my skills, everything in me gets tested, gets engaged. Right? Yeah, production is another thing. I mean, I would ask, what is the division, what is the distinction between production and reproduction, for instance? To what extent we reproduce meanings? Can meanings be reproduced? Or are they constantly invented anew? I mean, reproduction is a problem, but the incapability to reproduce a thing is also a problem. Like, this is the incapability of understanding. And with the NFT, I do have a feeling that the NFT might be the end of the technical reproduction of art, because this is something that cannot be reproduced, because the very idea of it is that it is unique. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but how can you reproduce an NFT, for instance? It starts reminding me of the bourgeois, attitude towards a work of art that is, that
Yeah.
exists for the sake of just,
Yeah, but it's
has.
money here that is reproducing the NFT. Think of it like, I mean, we have to think out of the box in terms of money, like as a monetary system, right? Because we are very familiar already with our monetary systems, and we can't envision monetary systems that go beyond like the dollar, the euro, what you buy, you sell. So as NFT is actually a child of two things, of like form and creation, and this effort to bring how can we call this, to bring free market to some other level, right? That's how I see NFT. There is from one side free market that wants to go to another level, so it doesn't depend from what like people are buying out there, because they can't like fuel it. The free market have felt that on its own skin. That people buying like some electronics here, some clothes there, some cars is not enough, because then you have big crisis and it dies free market itself. So desperately is looking for some alternatives. And NFT and cryptocurrency is one thing, but then the NFT is this combination of the two. From one side, the big creative spirit, which is like what we are doing with electronics, like all of us. We are part of a big creative wave. But this big creative wave goes and meets the same way that in Renaissance, like painting meet the bankers, the agony of the free market. So like what you said before, like how can it change an NFT? An NFT can change through its monetary like side. There's a monetary side, but a new monetary side we can't really entertain yet how it is, but we already can start having some feelings about it. So that's like where we are useful also. Like we artists, we are useless unless on that place there where we can feel on our skin something that is happening and other people cannot, and we are kind of prophetic sometimes. So yes, NFT, it can go on, I don't think that transformation, like what you said before, how did you call it, reproducibility, will ever disappear. If it disappears, it means we are already robots, because that's exactly what happens with the art I referred before, with the 90% of Western production. It's not reproducible because there is nothing there to reproduce. At a sun or a horse or a woman painted in this, like, we call it kitsch, but it's not kitsch in that way, in that massified way.
Well, I wonder if the forces that actually support the uniqueness of an artifact, for instance, I wonder to what extent they do that, because the reproduction of a thing is one thing, but, well, the reproduction of a pattern is another thing. And this is where the form is constantly pre-given. Okay, and when you were speaking about the faces, Miltos, I actually remember Jean-Luc Marion, who said that, well, I do not see an eye and then another eye and then a nose and then understand that it's a face. I first see a face as an integrated and unified object, and then I start discerning the details. And I wonder, would it even be possible to understand that it's a face? For instance, if you try to reproduce it in your mind, one detail after another, is there any way to achieve the completeness if we move step by step? So when there is a pattern in art that is pre-given and it's constantly reproduced, it's starts being a problem, certainly, because there is no tacit and natural understanding of what we are doing when we are, for instance, writing a novel, just because there is a history of a novel. Know what I mean? So I'm pretty much for the I believe that the automation is a problem, and the constraints that are given by the digital are very important, I believe. Like when we have to struggle with the material, when we have to struggle with the form, this is what keeps us aware of what we are doing. And this is why I actually love the challenge that comes from digital literature, for instance.
I think, yeah, and I think I like your cultural warrior addendum to what I was thinking of in relation to what Miltos brought up. I think is a good way of putting, sort of encapsulating what the point that you're making, the important point you're making. For me, I mean, like, and you almost pose the opposite question leading into that, or you pose the problem right after sort of having the problematic, if I can say, and the reproduction production question, right? If we solve that through NFT, if let's suppose that has a truth to it, well, that's an economic truth, right? Copyright is the same kind of thing, right? Or how we have contracts, or we've had immaterial works in a lot of ways. And economically speaking, that's never really been an issue. In fact, it's kind of an advantage because these are products that are much easier to verify. And NFT is the ultimate version of that, right? And we can get more esoteric versions, right? All you need to do is add the layers of kind of bureaucratic emptiness, right? But it's an economic response, right? It would do nothing for the cultural response, and in fact, it could do exactly the opposite. It could actually aggravate that, right? In a way, I think Marx's original. I feel a lot of this is springing from Marx's Marxist point that this labor, like, like what is going on with that labor? And there is actually, even though I kind of said, I kind of juxtapose this cultural element, which a lot of Western, a lot of this Western Marxist kind of thought does or adds in or says it's lacking. But I think in a deep sense, there's a romantic element going on there, or there's a strong cultural element. There's still that Hegelian inside Marx. And there is that question of what that culture is. What is that? I mean, what is kitsch culture? It's popular culture, right? It is that culture of the working class and of the common person, whatever that might, however we might try and conceive that. So in a sense, that deep question, the question that's below that surface, right, is how do you actually, that the reproduction is always a problem. Period, right? And the end of it is always a cultural sort of struggle. And it really, I mean, the economic layers on top of it, this is just, we can write norms and we can trade abstractions, but the question is always, where's the population and what are the resources that are getting drawn into that? And what is the actual environmental kind of context that's being drawn into that? And who are the workers drawing that out? And who are the, the citizens that are actually, engaging with those products and resources?
I'm a literature guy, so reproduction isn't really a problem for me. And like, think about music, okay? You write a song and you sing it and people like it. And then other people reproduce it and reinterpret it. And that's just the way the world is. And you can't change that and still be singing songs. If you could change it, then you wouldn't be singing songs, you'd be making sculptures.
Exactly. This is actually what I was talking about. Well, we are bound to reside in our culture, but yeah, sometimes when there is a question of what it is, what am I doing? Is this even a song? Is this even a novel? Is it a video game or is it something else? Well, sometimes I'm as well after these adventures, when you do not know whether you're singing a song or you're doing something different. Like this is what for instance, this is what Eisenstein was doing. I mean, for him, unlike Tarkovsky, for instance, because you might know Tarkovsky used to hate Russian avant-garde, and he said experimental stuff is not for the artists, which is like totally based. I'm kind of very much admired by Tarkovsky because he always knew what he wanted. Zepka or Eisenstein, or for instance, the French guys like Germain Delac, for instance, they didn't know what they were doing. I mean, they wanted to know what technology would allow them to do so, and they're kind of a little bit more adventurous. I would be maybe after the golden middle, something like that, something in between. So yeah.
And I would not say that Tchaikovsky was unadventurous. And, his colleague Sibelius is doing things with scent organs at the same time.
Okay.
Which is synesthesia. And there's this great line from Sibelius to Ken Kesey's acid tests with the Grateful Dead. And
Totally. Well, and Stockhausen's experiments converted into rock and industrial music. I wouldn't say easily, but it's contributed a lot to pop music. Pop music, I mean, mass culture, pop culture has always been connected with the avant-garde. I mean, this is just fascinating how easily pop culture appropriates avant-garde stuff and vice versa. I mean, this is totally amazing. And this is where, again, video games come. Yeah, as Erik says, video games don't have to be artistic and sophisticated to contribute to the art, because they are already well as David Bolter, I believe it was, said that video games are between the two avant-gardes, the avant-garde of the formal and the avant-garde of the political. Yeah, pop culture does contribute a lot to the experimental art, definitely. But so, anyone have any other comments and questions and suggestions and other things to contribute?
I like the. I mean, I think Mark just turned on its head the just everything I was thinking before that, because I mean, now thinking about oral tradition, and like I think that because there's always this, I was really into all this I don't know, we can call it uncreative, or the l'autrement kind of thing of dealing with this. It's like we have this tide of plagiaristic inevitability, or we have the citational complex, or just this bureaucratic deluge of crap, which is, it's all the same thing, right? Pyramid scheme is the corporation. Like it's all these added elements that if you need a bibliography of 100 authors, like how is that not? I mean, you've just formalized plagiarism, right? You've just sort of demanded it, but you've demanded it codified, and you've done it in a preemptive way that makes sure that you'll have it. You need it. You need all of these. You need to be reading a ton of people and then taking something from them, right? Twisting it in a very sort of minimal kind of way, and so on. We've really got this dressing on top of what is culture, right? When you have this pre-literate element, you have all the things that Mark brought up, and in this way that loses some of the logistic problems, right? Because it's just, this is what humans do. This is how you tell jokes, and you do theater, and you take a mythical base, and you sort of each kind of have your own way of spinning it with your own experience, and whatever you sort of add, and you go from Aeschylus to Sophocles to Euripides, and you see this kind of interesting evolution of same stories, right? Largely kind of taken elsewhere, and maybe expected to. Maybe this is what the tradition is. So I don't know. I think it's just threw a nice wrench right in the center of our kind of main question, which is what is this thing that's at stake? What is this kind of, like, when you say that reproducibility is that sort of thing, that unsustainable thing, or what element is unsustainable? What is the quote unquote dead element of that technology that is the creative kind of impulse that we're continually creating, right? That unstable book is always something that is in generation and being interpreted, right? Certainly, I think there's just some kind of saturation, but I think getting to that analytical point is, I mean, for me, it's like this constant challenge of how and where do you actually start to delineate that? And I just wanted to say, I almost think right away, Kirill, when your very last point, I think of, I love hearing you talk about the Russian cinematic history, because we don't, I mean, it's weird how we have, it's a very particular way that we sort of organize globality in the West, and we have this sort of tokenization of, within the Anglophone sphere, and then we have sort of like, okay, we can have a French, director or two, and we can have, we sort of have this menagerie. And I remember when I was in Thailand, and I was talking with sort of filmmakers there, and you have the Bon Mi, the Therasethicool, who is, he's the guy, he's all, and there's this guy, Sasanatiang, who is, I just love him, he's my favorite. And it's the same in Iran, Kiarostami, and then Makhmalbaf, who I think is just doing just amazing stuff, is just, we just can only take in so much. So to get those internal views, I think, is so crucial, and it becomes so different, I think, when you get that. And that kind of genealogy, I think, is interesting. I think it sort of maps with your last remark, that the formal avant-garde may be, or the formal question, the political question, maybe that tension that you're seeing between Tarkovsky Eisenstein. I've always felt much more drawn to what Eisenstein is up to and the kind of spiritual thing that Tarkovsky that somehow fits nicely into that exotic tokenized blend, that the translation discourse likes. It's really interesting to hear how they're pitted against each other. And I mean, Eisenstein just has this wonderful, energized political kind of thing that I think if there is a kind of solution to reach towards within the kind of things we're talking about, it's somewhere there, right? Because it really is being reckoned with.
Well, yeah, there is an assumption that if you are looking at something very closely, you're capable of changing it, right? So this is kind of what early cinematic avant-garde kind of presumes. Well, at least in the Soviet Union, right? If you look closely, you can change it. And this is the problem actually with the writers like Gorky, for instance, who's said to be not that efficient in terms of the industrial changes, because he comes from an earlier tradition. And this is also about the disengagement, the great disengagement that dates back to Tolstoy and before.
Yeah.
Those
I was totally thinking.
Yeah, because those guys, they might talk about the problems of people, but they talk about it in their privileged way, from their privileged position. After all, they are not modern enough, they are not experimental enough. So they were blamed for that. And Gorky, first of all, was blamed by Lovsky, for instance, Tretyakov, those guys. So it's about the formal stuff. I mean, political and formal, they always come together, I believe. So it's sort of inevitable that gotta reinvent. Like imagine, like remember George Agamben in the early 2020, like when the pandemic started, he got hated because he tried to apply his old theories of emergency to the COVID situation. And it kind of made people angry, because you always got to reinvent stuff. You cannot just move along with the old patterns all the time, can you? So, and I do have a feeling that perhaps there are tools that haven't been investigated pretty thoroughly, like for instance, hypertext. I believe that hypertext is somewhere between games, well, it's certainly between games and literature, but it's kind of like game studies look at hypertext as old games, Literary studies looks at hypertext as new literature.
Yeah, and I think yeah, for me personally, it was like you saw, I showed not my earliest work, but some of my early work that started to deal with code and stuff, and really started to get deeper into computation, and not just sort of dealing with a book and then getting into multimedia and then slowly going, okay, I'm going to go back to the Pascal and the C++ that I was doing in my labs and stuff, and start kind of like seeing what are good creative code sets to start looking into. Which the bad bet was Flash, and I went for it, and I didn't realize that Steve Jobs was gonna go for the jugular on Adobe, and and take them down. But anyways, but there's lots of others, and I've spent a lot of time, you know, bouncing around between them. But yeah, I mean, for me at that time, it was really anyway. So you saw some of the stuff, and it's really for me, it was sort of okay. Hypertext was this thing that happened within the ELIT trajectory, and then I'm going to be doing these sort of other things that are more to do with visual elements or code poetics or you know, experimenting with I don't know, something a little bit maybe more. I guess repeating some of the things that I started with, looking at these things of you know, the concrete elements going on, or you know, experimental things that have happened in other media before, and I'm sort of, you know, so I sort of, that was me looking back, and yeah, I was reading some hypertext and getting to know it, but I wasn't really trying to kind of do it. But now looking at the game history, and I think this can do it. This is just the renovation I think that you're talking about. That I need to look out the Agamben thing because that's interesting. I like that kind of. There's something in cultural theory where it's, for me, it's pretty vague. Like in science, it's pretty clear. You always have this sort of object history. You know, when the disputes might be stupid and academic, like they almost always are, but at least you can actually delineate what's going on. But in cultural theory, I find this vagueness where it's almost like you need to get to know the community to understand why, you know, that category became arcane or problematic. And Agamben, I sort of sense it might be, I get a sense of it because I knew a lot of these more kind of spec realist associated people, and Agamben was this person who was difficult. He might not be cool anymore, you know. But it's interesting because this speaks to exactly the bigger picture that you're talking about, right? Which is the question of how can you make it new again, or how can you make it relevant? How can you make it you know, applicable? And there's this constant kind of demand for that. You know, we might have the more politicized elements, but we always have this basic kind of epistemological need to have, you know, an idea that marries its creativity with its pragmatics, right? And you know, emergency falls in that. Anyway, so hypertext for me became that within the larger game history, and I've really found it interesting because the thing that I love about it is that, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know what you think of any of this, Mark, but I'll be interested to hear. But for me, what's so interesting is that it really is a parallel kind of evolution. I mean, when Eastgate comes out for me in '87, or I don't know if that's right, but you know, this is the move to graphical games, right? And this is really like, you have some of the earliest games that have like LucasArts comes out with the game, I think it's '86, where they have the it was the first movie adaptation one. It was the one not Willow, but another one of those fantasy. Anyways, LucasArts is coming out. You have Maniac Mansion in '87, and so these are no longer text input. This is no longer the Sierra mechanism, right? You no longer have this, and so they have this wheel at first, and then they have, you know, Maniac Mansion. Most people know you start to have this like use and take, and you have this sort of menus that it will drop out. It's point and click, right? We have the point and click, and hypertext is that, but it's still textual, right? Whereas you still have text adventures getting produced, but they don't ever have, you know, the point and click. Not never, but it isn't the common trope. Whereas graphical adventures really go to the same input mechanism. So within all that, to me, it's quite interesting because now when you have things like Twine and stuff, I mean, they're doing the same thing. This is the same thing. This is point and click text, you know, and it's almost like pure UI or something. That's the closest I get to finding an analogy. So within the deep history of video games and all the deep technical options that get explored, and obviously genres are not everything. You get exceptions, so you will have exceptions, right? Where people are doing that. But to me, then it's quite interesting. So that I guess you know, pose this as a question for you, Mark. Was this something that you were kind of looking at these text adventures and looking at the rise of the sort of mouse with the Mac coming out and stuff, and saying, this is where I want to insert myself? Or was it a natural evolution to pick a point and click text interface? Were you really looking at games and going, I want to be in dialogue with this?
I guess you don't get a choice to be in dialogue with games in this generation or that generation. You will be in dialogue with them. But I would say all of the artifacts that you described, I would call hypertexts. I don't subscribe to this Nick Montfort mythology that hypertext is just a precursor, then hypertext must be composed in E-flat major, and our generation invented minor keys. I mean, it's a good move if you want to get tenure, but it's not actually true to the work.
Yeah, fair, good answer. Yeah. No, it's another one of these academic moves that we were talking about, and that's actually interesting. I think because I mean, I like his code identification. I didn't. So is it really just him who sort of? Because within ELIT circles, there really is this received idea on some level that I never really. I mean, the way you blew it up instantly was sort of the suspicion I always had. But is that really just him? I mean, I guess it's him and other writers within
Talon
that.
Mehmet
The code work, Talon.
There's a Finn whose name I'm forgetting, but don't tell me.
It's not Yuka-Pekka Kervin, no.
No.
It's not just but it's code work. You're talking about code. You're talking about code work.
Mackenzie work.
No, but code work, that listserv, and that like maybe even Sondheim being involved. Involved. Yeah.
I mean,
definitely Talon as well. Yeah. I see what you're saying. So it's almost like them, demarking some territory or something. And I see that.
But all of these, I don't think there's anything profound in the separation between illustrated electronic texts and purely textual electronic texts, or electronic texts that have some embedded video, or videos that have some embedded text. Now, don't get me wrong. I think these are fascinating borders, and I can go on forever about the meaning of various minor user interface changes. This is what I do, but I don't think that because M. Short writes things where you type words and Michael Joyce writes things where you poke at words, that's a tremendous difference in the nature of literature.
Yeah. I think for me the things I really, I mean, one thing was the PC itself becoming a thing that that you have video games all through the 60s and 70s for sure, in the 50s as well, and a lot. Like you've got almost every genre, in my opinion. And I've been kind of scoring it as best as I can. And but you get a commercial difference. And so in 77, when you get those, you get the sort of rat race of big PC manufacturers. You got Radio Shack and Apple and Commodore and so on. This to me is a moment, and then the moment when the mouse is popularized. It's been around for a long time. Xerox didn't just have it; they tried to actually implement it, but it's with the Mac. I mean, the Mac isn't even really popular. It's probably Windows actually that we should be talking about. But anyways, mid 80s. Then I definitely, those are the only things that I really have found that I can hold on to. So I do appreciate that for you. It's not really substantial, because for me it's pretty liquid. And yet I still think that there's this, it is just the type of game, and it's in the continuum, but there is a unique style that Eastgate did carve out. So. But I mean, when you design it, so when you design that software, then it was just you just wanted something literary, and you were just going to use the tools at hand. So because the mouse was at hand, you were gonna do that. I mean, on a personal level, then, instead of these semantic questions, what was your what were you envisioning for Eastgate?
Well, for first, Story Space was actually Jay Bolter and Michael Joyce. I got involved later. I had a system called Hypergate, which was, and all through, I thought that the natural application was going to be nonfiction, textbooks, tech writing, and creative nonfiction. And that fiction was a convenient way to bridge the gap between disciplines. Tech writers don't want to read history, don't want to use tools meant for historians, but everyone can identify with the problems of novel writers or screenwriters. So I mean, that's what I thought I was doing then. And you use the tools that could get your work in front of people. I mean, it was ever thus, but you needed, if the Mac had 1 million users, that was an audience. And if you wanted to write for the Mac, you had to write for the mouse.
Yeah. So and I've downloaded your, is it freeware? What is your current software? So you've got I just had to look it up, but It's another,
Yeah.
is it another kind of interactive text system?
Well, I mean, we still have Story Space. Most
Yeah.
of the money comes from Tinderbox, which is a Story Space derivative for making and visualizing notes. And it's like Twine, it descends from Story Space. And but this is forking off the part of Story Space that ended up being used for anthropology and sociology and field notes and whatnot.
Nice. When did you start getting involved with Eastgate?
We started it in 82. The hypertext work really begins about 84.
Okay, so you're with Eastgate, but Story Space itself is a project. That was something that was part of
Story
Eastgate.
Space as a project began with a Bolter and Joyce doing postdocs at Yale with Shank's group in 85, 86.
Okay. And sorry, so Eastgate and Story Space are not connected?
Well, they got connected because we ended up taking over the marketing of Story Space.
And that's 87?
It was 89 or 90.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Nice. So what is the first thing Eastgate did then? This is so nice to get the first person story, because yeah, I was getting the garbled partisan version, I think, with
the first hypertext system was a help system, hypertext help system for a tool that was eventually marketed as Rapid File by Ashton Tate. That'll take you back ways.
So that's the first
PC
product
database.
that Eastgate was working on. It was already it's always been hypertext, and that was the
that's the first product thing that actually shipped. And we did a certain amount of consulting to buy groceries.
Yeah, well, about a couple of months ago, I was given some, well, it wasn't a lecture, it was kind of a public talk that was about digital literature. And in Russia, it's not very common it's a very common thing to discuss. And well, the people there were mostly concerned with the fact that, well, how come that, the computer is capable of, inventing stories and such. And for me, it was nonsense. Like, people were speaking totally different direction that I actually expected. And so I tried to, change the topic a little bit. And what I was talking about, I needed to give the idea why the digital literature is interesting and like very fast. And from my position, because I had no idea what those people were having in their minds. So I needed to give my view of it. And I kind of, that well, for me, digital literature is something that is not phenomenologically revealed at once. This is not something that is given to you right away, which is kind of interesting. And I would compare it with the rusty language that is not automatic, that always stumbles, it always make you stumble as well, and look for different ways to approach it. Like with the Dreamhold, for instance, blew my mind and broke well, my reading patterns when I was reading it, solving it. So something that it's not, well, of course, it's a puzzle as well. I mean, a hypertext, but there is something else. It's also a mystery. I mean, this is a puzzle and a mystery, which bears like it's enormous artistic potential. There's enormous artistic potential in it, I believe. And I kind of feel bad when people start treating this medium as just old games, because there's no way it's old games. It's new literature. It's new literature. Really.
Or new games.
Or new games. Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Not old games. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, well, old games are also good, but it's not about age at all.
Good
I
old
mean,
games. GOG, not bad old games. Yeah.
yeah. I gotta go soon. It's 3 a.m.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Fascinating talk.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks to you and the other people as well. Thank you, Miltos. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Mark.
Stay in
Okay.
touch.
So nice talking with you guys. What a pleasure. What a pleasure meeting you.
Cool.
Totally a pleasure. Enormous pleasure. Okay, so have a wonderful day. I know that it's not early where you are as well, but you still have the remains of your day.
Cheers,
And,
Erik.
yeah.
No, I'm with you. I'm
Coin a
Europe.
phrase.
These Americans are, yeah, they're going through what we're going through on this on the Eurasian continent, the old world. So yeah, it's late here too.
Well, the oral world is, yeah, going to have a new day pretty soon. So,
The
On
sun
that note,
also rises.
yeah. Which was in Europe. Oh my God, written by an American. It's perfect. Okay, we got to end now. It's too perfect. Too perfect.
Take care.
See you guys. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
yeah, guys.
You.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Take care.
Take care.